bright office lobby, a suited man mocked the courier, standing before him with one box in his hands. The room saw nobody. But what if the thing they wanted signed away was the only reason he still stood firm? The sound. Caleb Brooks did not trust a cardboard box unless the seal was still tight. He stood in the back room of the old community bank archive, with a clipboard in one hand and his phone in the other, photographing the strip of red tape that crossed the first file carton. The room had no windows. The air was dry and dusty, the kind of air that made every breath feel as if it had passed through paper first. Shelves ran in narrow rows from wall to wall, each one stacked with boxes marked by old loan numbers, client folders, and faded labels no one had cared enough to rewrite. Box 1, Caleb said under his breath, putting the printed inventory against the number on the seal. Seal intact. He wrote the number down, then took a second photo. A man who got careless with paper could lose more than a job. Caleb knew that better than most. He had learned it young. Before he understood interest rates, notary stamps, or why grown people could say the word fraud in a kitchen and make every plate on the table seem suddenly too loud. The asset management company that had bought the bank's old loan files called this work temporary document processing. Caleb called it staying clean. Every box logged, every seal photographed, every page scanned in order, every handoff signed, no shortcuts. He had taken the assignment because it paid better than night work at the campus office and did not ask questions about his family. The contract supervisor had told him the files were routine: closed mortgages, old refinancing packets, elderly clients, estate records, nothing active enough to matter. Caleb had nodded, accepted the badge, and asked where they kept the chain of custody forms. The supervisor had looked at him as if he were making the job harder than it needed to be. Caleb was used to that look. He set the first box on the scanning table and opened it with a utility blade, careful not to tear the seal number. Inside were folders packed so tightly the edges had bent. He lifted the stack and found the usual forms: loan summaries, signature pages, disclosure statements, copies of identification from closing appointments. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just the quiet paperwork by which people trusted other people with their homes. That was what made him slow down. Most people thought danger announced itself. Beyond. Caleb had learned that sometimes it came with a clean staple, a polite cover letter, and a place for someone tired to sign at the bottom. He scanned for 3 hours without stopping. When a page jammed, he cleared it, rescanned the packet, and marked the delay in the log. When a folder was missing a closing checklist, he placed a yellow flag on the outside and wrote, "Incomplete," in block letters. He did not guess. He did not fix, rearrange. Near mid-morning, he reached a folder with a borrower name that made his hand pause, not because he recognized it at first. It was an ordinary name, the kind that could belong to a retired teacher, a widow from a small brick house, a woman who kept receipts in a kitchen drawer. But beneath it, clipped to the inside flap, was a note written in blue ink: "Review before release." DB. Caleb stared at those 2 letters. His father's initials had lived in his life like a stain that would not wash out. Daniel Brooks had once worked in banking, back when neighbors still came into a branch and expected the person across the desk to know their name. Came the accusation: forged signatures, elderly borrowers, bad loans. After that, people stopped saying Daniel and started saying what he had done. Caleb closed the folder, reopened it, and looked again. It was only a note, 2 initials. Nothing more. He forced himself to breathe, then photographed the folder label, the note, and the seal record from the box. He did not remove anything. He did not slip the page aside. Feely wrote the borrower name on his clipboard and placed the folder back exactly where he had found it. By the end of the shift, he had logged 11 boxes, scanned 7, and flagged 4 for missing supporting documents. He signed out with the same careful hand he used for rent checks and school forms. Then he drove home through the flat gray evening with the borrower name sitting in his mind like a small stone under the tongue. Ellen Brooks was at her kitchen table. When he arrived, a pair of reading glasses low on her nose and a utility bill spread beneath one finger. The kitchen was warm, but not soft. Feel. It was a room that had survived too many conversations by keeping itself clean. "You're late," she said. "Had to finish the handoff." She looked up. "You always have to finish something." Caleb set his keys in the chipped bowl by the door. "That's how people avoid trouble." "No," Evelyn said, folding the bill with sharp, practiced edges. "That's how good people think trouble will respect them." He did not answer. Well, there were sentences in that house that had been repeated so many times they no longer needed a reply. On the small side table near the pantry sat the old laptop Daniel had left behind. Caleb pulled it from a closet weeks earlier, telling himself he only wanted to recover family photographs. What he had found instead was a plain document full of names. No explanations, no dates that meant anything to him, just names, lined one after another, as if his father had been afraid he would forget them. Evelyn had noticed the laptop the first night it appeared. She had not asked him to put it away. That was almost worse. Caleb washed his hands at the sink, dried them, and stood for a moment with the towel still in his grip. "Grandma," he said, "do you remember any of the names from back then?" Her face changed by not changing. "Remember enough to know you shouldn't be asking. I found one today." The room went quiet around the old refrigerator hum. "In the archive," Caleb said. "One of the loan folders." There was a note with Dad's initials. Lynn took off her glasses and laid them on the folded bill. "Your father's name cost this family more than you understand." "I understand plenty." "No," she said, but her voice was not angry now. It was tired. "You understand what it did to you. You don't understand what it did before you were old enough to see it." Caleb looked toward the laptop. He wanted to tell her he was not chasing ghosts. Then he wanted to tell her he was only making sure the paperwork matched. But both would have been half true, and Evelyn had raised him to fear half-truths more than lies. He opened the laptop. It took a long time to wake. The screen flickered, then filled with the old document exactly where he had left it. Caleb scrolled slowly, one name at a time, while Evelyn remained seated behind him, silent. Halfway down the page, he stopped. The name from the folder was there. Same spelling, same middle initial. Nothing beside it. No explanation. Just another line in Daniel's list of people nobody in the family had ever talked about. Caleb placed his finger on the screen, not touching hard enough to smudge it, just enough to steady himself. Behind him, Evelyn whispered, "What is it?" Caleb did not turn around. "It's not just his initials," he said. Yes. He had her name. By morning, the name on Daniel's old list had become a problem. Caleb could not put back in the dark. He did not tell Evelyn he was going to look again. He only packed his lunch, checked the latches on his work bag, and drove back to the archive, with the kind of careful silence that had carried him through most of his adult life. The box he had logged the day before was still on the intake shelf, seal cut cleanly, and taped to the chain of custody sheet exactly where he had left it. Caleb signed in, set his phone face up beside the scanner, and pulled the flagged folder from the stack. The first packet looked ordinary. Reverse mortgage application. A disclosure form. A closing checklist. The borrower's initials appeared where they were supposed to appear. But on the last page, beneath the notary stamp, Caleb saw a signature that made him stop. That was too familiar. Not the name. The shape. He pulled the next flagged folder, then another, then one from the bottom of the same box. Different borrowers, different homes, different dates blurred by old copier ink and handling. The notary signature bent the same way. Every time the first letter pressed too hard, the last name trailing off, as if the hand had grown tired in the same place. Caleb did not move for nearly a minute. He had seen bad scans before. He had seen copied packets, refilled pages, signatures that looked similar because tired office workers signed too many forms in a day. A pattern did not prove anything. A feeling proved less. Did what he trusted. He laid the pages side by side, photographed each document header, logged the folder numbers, and marked the notary pages for supervisor review. Then he opened the old list from Daniel's laptop on his phone and checked the names one at a time. The first was there. The second was there. The third made Caleb sit back in his chair. The scanning room kept moving around him. Theater clicked. The overhead light hummed. Somewhere beyond the frosted glass wall, someone laughed at something small, an office safe. Caleb looked down at the forms and felt the shape of the thing change. Phil, a sound. This was no longer one name in an old folder. This was a line running through several lives, and his father's initials were sitting near the first knot. He placed the documents back inside the file, exactly as he had found them. Then he reached for the unsigned transfer sheet that had been clipped to the top of the box. The receiving line was blank. No one had taken custody of it after him. That mattered. A sharp knock hit the glass. Caleb looked up. A woman stood outside the scanning room door with a legal pad held close against her chest. Blonde hair, neat jacket, a face trained to reveal very little. He had seen her pass quiet morning without speaking. "Mr. Brooks," he said through the open crack. "Preston wants that box upstairs." Caleb kept one hand on the folder. "I don't have a signed handoff." Her eyes moved to the transfer sheet. He said now. "Then he can sign for it." The woman did not argue. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. She looked at him, then at the box, and something in her expression shifted. Not approval, not quite concern. "Just attention, I'll tell him," she said. 10 minutes later, Caleb was called to the front lobby. The lobby looked nothing like the archive. It was all polished stone, quiet lighting, thin leather chairs arranged as if no one there had ever waited for anything they couldn't afford. Caleb carried the file box with both hands, the unsigned transfer sheet clipped to the top. He had changed nothing. He had removed nothing. The seal record, the folder count, the intake sheet, everything was where it belonged. Preston Hale stood near the reception desk, with an older client in a wool coat beside him. A blonde woman from the scanning room stood a few feet back, legal pad open, pencil ready. Her eyes found the box before they found Caleb. Preston smiled first. That made Caleb more careful. "Caleb," Preston said, if they were friendly. "I need those records." Caleb held out the clipboard, not the box. I need a receiving signature." Preston did not take the clipboard. "This is an internal request. It's still a controlled file set." The older client glanced between them. The receptionist pretended to look at her screen. The lobby seemed to grow quieter by choice. Preston's smile thinned. "Young man, you were hired to scan documents, not interpret compliance." Felt the heat rise in his neck, but his grip stayed steady. "I'm not interpreting anything. I'm following the handoff sheet." "The box," Preston said, extending his hand. "The signature first." For a moment, no one moved. Preston stepped closer and pointed at Caleb's chest, not touching him, but close enough for everyone to understand what he meant. "You think carrying a clipboard makes you important?" Caleb swallowed once. He could feel the old instinct waking up, the one that told him to apologize, to smooth it over, to make himself small before someone with a better suit decided what kind of man he was. Taken him years to learn. That small did not mean safe. "No," Caleb said. "I think an unsigned transfer makes me responsible." The client shifted uncomfortably. The blonde woman's pencil stopped moving. Preston's face hardened. "You are standing in my lobby refusing a direct instruction. I'm standing here with a box no one has signed for." The words landed harder than Caleb expected. Not because they were loud, because they were plain. Preston looked at the box as if it had betrayed him. Then he turned slightly toward the blonde woman. "Marin, prepare a note that Mr. Brooks is delaying authorized document review." Then Ellis looked down at her pad. For a second, Caleb thought she would write exactly what Preston wanted. Instead, she said, "Do you want me to include that the transfer sheet is unsigned?" The question hung there. Preston looked at her. "That won't be necessary." Caleb heard the warning in his voice. Marin must have heard it too, because her face closed again. But she did not write. Preston took one slow breath, then lowered his hand. "Return the box to the file room. Do not open anything else in that set until you're told." Caleb nodded once. He did not trust himself to say more. He carried the box back through the side hallway, aware of every step, every camera, polished surface reflecting him like someone who did not belong there. He expected the hallway to be empty. It was not. Marin stood near the service door, legal pad pressed flat against her side. "You were right not to hand it over," she said. Caleb stopped, still holding the box. "You work for him?" "Yes." "Then you shouldn't be telling me that." "No," she said. "I probably shouldn't." He waited. The air in the narrow hall felt colder than the lobby. Marin glanced toward the corner, where the hallway turned back to reception. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "There's a name in that box," she said. "An older woman, Ellis." Caleb's hands tightened against the cardboard. "My grandmother," Marin said. "She lost her house after signing papers she never understood. I found her name in the archive last week, but opened the file, without losing access to the rest of it." Caleb did not answer right away. The box between them felt heavier now. No longer just paper. No longer just his father's shadow. Fear. Marin looked at that transfer sheet clipped to the top. "If her file is in there," she said, "then your father wasn't the only one they buried." Marin did not ask Caleb to trust her in the hallway. He asked him to check one more thing. That was why, the next morning, he sat across from her in a booth at an old diner near the bank building that no longer carried the bank's name. DC Distiriti, except for two men at the counter, and a waitress refilling coffee without asking. Caleb had the file box number written on a napkin, though he had already memorized it. Marin had a small notebook open in front of her, the pencil resting across the page like she was afraid to touch it. "You said your grandmother's name was in the archive," Caleb said. Marin nodded. "I saw it on an index sheet, didn't open the file. Because Preston would know. Because every access badge in that room gets logged," she said. "And because if I got locked out, I'd never see another box." Caleb looked through the diner window toward the old bank building across the street. Its front doors had been replaced, but the stone around them was still the same dull gray feel. He could imagine his father walking in there with a lunch bag, a tie that never sat quite right, and a name people trusted before they learned to whisper it. Marin slid a folded copy of an inventory list across the table. Person who might know what happened before those files were boxed. Caleb opened it. One name had been circled in pencil. George Talbot. He was security, Marin said. Worked nights. He signed off on storage access, back when the loan files were still in the basement. "You know where he is?" "I know where he used to live. I called the number listed on an old vendor form." He answered. When I asked about the bank, he hung up. Caleb folded the paper again, slower this time. Then he remembers, or he's scared. Same thing, sometimes. Found George in a small house with a sagging porch and a storm door that rattled when he opened it. He was thinner than Caleb expected, with a cardigan hanging loose on his shoulders and eyes that went first to Marin's face, into Caleb's hands as if checking whether they had brought papers, badges, or trouble. "I already told her I don't know anything," George said. Caleb did not step forward. He had learned that cornering an old man was no way to get the truth. "My father was Daniel Brooks," he said. The name struck the porch like a dropped cup. George's hand tightened around the edge of the door. For a moment, he looked past Caleb rather than at him, and his mouth moved once before any sound came out. "I'm sorry," George said. Caleb had expected denial. He had expected anger. He had not expected an apology to arrive first, small and worn down by years. "For what?" Caleb asked. George looked at Marin. "You'd better come in." The house smelled faintly of medicine, old wood, and coffee left too long on a burner. George led them to a cramped sitting room where baseball programs were stacked on a side table and a wall clock ticked too loudly. He lowered himself into a chair and pointed Caleb and Marin toward the sofa. Either of them sat right away. "I was on nights," George said. "Most folks forgot I was there unless a pipe burst or somebody locked themselves out." "Your father never forgot." Caleb stayed still. "He came to me. After closing one night," George continued. "Said he'd needed into the basement file room. Said some older clients were being moved into loans they didn't understand. He wanted copies before the records disappeared." Marin's pencil had appeared in her hand, but she had not written yet. "Did you let him in?" Caleb asked. George looked toward the hallway. I gave him the spare key. He pushed himself up from the chair and left the room. Caleb heard a drawer open, then another. When George came back, he carried two things: a brass key, darkened with age, and a black logbook with worn corners. He set them on the coffee table as if they were heavier than they looked. He opened the basement file cage, George said. And that book shows when he went in. Caleb reached toward the logbook, then stopped before touching it. May I? George nodded. The pages were lined by hand. Names, times, room numbers, signatures. Not official enough to impress a lawyer at first glance. Maybe, but not nothing. Caleb turned the pages carefully until George leaned forward and tapped one entry with a bent finger. There, he said. Daniel. After hours. Basement file room. The reason column held only 3 words. Client document review. Caleb read them twice. Something inside him shifted, but it did not feel like relief. Relief would have been too simple, felt. More like finding out a locked room had never been empty. His father had not been sneaking in to steal. He had been trying to preserve something before someone stronger took it away. Marin finally wrote in her notebook, and this be matched to the folders Caleb scanned. If the box numbers survived, George said. And if nobody says I made it up, Caleb looked up. Would they? George gave a tired laugh without humor. Son, people said plenty back then. I let them. The room fell quiet. I should have spoken, George said. When they blamed him. When they said he'd forged those signatures. I should have said he was in that basement. Because he was worried about those people. His voice thinned. But I had a job. A pension coming. A wife who needed steady insurance. Father told me not to get pulled under with him. Caleb closed the logbook halfway. He told you that? George nodded. He said if they came after me too, nobody would be left to remember where the files had been. Caleb looked down at the old key. For years, he had carried anger at a man who seemed to have folded under pressure and left his family with the damage. Now the picture was worse and kinder at the same time. Daniel had been afraid, yes, but not only for himself. Marin leaned forward. George, if this goes public, Preston will say Caleb mishandled company files. He'll say anything copied or logged after the purchase is tainted. Why you need the old book, George said. It started before your company touched those boxes, and you'll say that? Caleb asked. George's eyes settled on him. The shame was still there. Something steadier had come up beneath it. I'm tired of being useful to the wrong people, he said. By the time they left, the key and logbook were sealed in a plain envelope with George's signature across the flap. Caleb photographed it on the coffee table, then again on the seat of his car, before placing it beside the inventory copy. Marin watched him do it without comment. In the parking lot near the office building, the evening pressed against the windshield. Caleb sat behind the wheel, while Marin stood outside his door, arms folded against the cold. We have to be careful now, she said. We were careful before. No, she said. Before, Preston wanted the box. Now, he'll want a reason to make you the problem. Caleb's phone buzzed before he could answer. The message was short. His archive access had been suspended pending review of unauthorized document handling, and read it over his shoulder. Her face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. Caleb looked at the sealed envelope on the passenger seat. George agreed to speak, he said, and glanced back at the lit windows of the office building. Then, we'd better make sure he gets heard before Preston tells everyone you stole the truth. The suspension notice stayed on Caleb's phone all night, glowing each time the screen woke, as if Preston had found a way to sit in the room with him. By morning, Caleb had stopped looking at the message. He had the sealed envelope from George, the photographed handoff sheets, the inventory numbers, and the packet Marin had helped assemble from records she could lawfully identify. None of it felt powerful in his hands. It felt ordinary. Paper, ink, signatures, timestamps, a brittle old logbook, and one small brass key in a clear evidence sleeve. But ordinary was all Daniel had ever had too. The hearing room in St. Louis was not large. It had a long table at the front, rows of plain chairs, clock that seemed louder than it should have been. Caleb sat with the packet in front of him, his hands resting on either side of it. Marin sat to his left, pale but steady. George sat 2 seats down, and his hat in both hands. Evelyn had come against Caleb's wishes and sat in the back row, her purse clutched in her lap, eyes fixed on him, as if she were afraid the room might swallow him the way the old bank had swallowed Daniel. Preston arrived looking calm. That was what made the room tighten. He did not look like a man worried about truth. Then he looked like a man prepared to explain it away. When his turn came, he stood and spoke in the smooth voice Caleb had heard in the lobby. "This matter is not about families, emotions, or old rumors," Preston said. "It is about procedure. Mr. Brooks was a temporary document worker. He exceeded his role, accessed sensitive materials, and attempted to use company property for a personal grievance." Caleb felt the old heat rise in his neck. Personal grievance. That was how men like Preston made us life small. A father's ruined name became a grievance. Elderly borrowers became materials. A locked box became company property instead of people's homes. The hearing officer turned toward Caleb. "Do you have a response?" Caleb opened the packet, but he did not rush. His fingers knew the order because he had checked it again and again. Intake sheet, seal photographs, signed transfer form, access record, matching folder numbers, repeated notary pages, George's logbook copy, Marin's index confirmation. "I didn't remove the box from custody," Caleb said. "Refused to transfer it without a signature." Preston gave a small laugh. "That is not the point." "It is the point," Marin said. Every head turned toward her. She placed her own notes on the table. Her hand shook once, steadied. The box Mr. Brooks refused to hand over contained files tied to a group of reverse mortgage agreements. My grandmother's name was on one of the index sheets. He recognized it before Mr. Brooks ever entered that archive. Preston's face changed just enough for Caleb to see the crack. "Marin," Preston said softly, "be careful." She looked at him then, not as an employee, as someone standing too close to the wrong side, but as a woman who had finally decided what her fear had cost. "I am being careful," she said. "That's why I wrote everything down." She laid out the folder numbers. Caleb added the matching seal photographs. One by one, the little pieces began to touch. A borrower name from Daniel's old list, a folder in the purchased archive, a repeated notary signature, a missing review page, then another borrower. Then another. Preston tried to turn the room back. "Patterns can be imagined," he said. "Old documents can be misread." George lifted his head. For a moment, the old man looked too fragile to carry anything. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed the worn logbook on the table. Beside it, Marin set the clear sleeve with the brass key. "I kept the night logs," George said. His voice was quiet. The room heard him. Daniel Brooks came into the basement file room after hours because he believed older clients were being pushed into papers they didn't understand. "I gave him the spare key." Preston leaned forward. "Expect this room to rely on an old security notebook?" "No," George said. "I expect you to read it." Caleb looked down. He did not smile. He could not. The entry sat there in faded ink, small and stubborn. "Daniel, in file room. Client document review." George swallowed. He wasn't stealing. He was trying to copy enough to protect them. The room was silent after that. Not dramatic, not loud, just silent in the way a room becomes when excuses start losing air. Marin identified the connection to her grandmother's file. George confirmed the access log. Caleb explained the chain of custody, the unsigned transfer, the reason he had photographed every seal. He never raised his voice. He never called Preston a liar. He only kept putting paper where a lie had been standing. By the time the hearing ended, Preston was no longer speaking smoothly. He was answering, then correcting himself, then saying less. The decision did not arrive like thunder. It came in steps. His license was suspended, then revoked, and he was ordered into review and required to compensate the families tied to the faulty agreements. The old internal record against Daniel was withdrawn and corrected. Theon gave Caleb back the years his family had spent lowering their voices around the Brooks name. But for the first time, the record no longer carried the lie. Evelyn read the notice at her kitchen table twice. Caleb stood across from her, not pushing, not asking for anything. The afternoon light lay gently across the folded paper between them. Finally, Evelyn reached for the drawer beside the stove. From beneath a stack of old envelopes, she pulled out a photograph Caleb had not seen in years. Daniel was younger in it, standing in a shirt-sleeved dress shirt, smiling like a man who still believed his name would be safe with people. Evelyn set the picture on the table. "I kept it," she said. Caleb nodded because his throat had gone tight. A few weeks later, the office he rented was small enough that the front desk nearly touched the waiting chairs. Fine outside was simple. Brooks' document review. No shine, no big promise, just clean letters on a modest window. The first morning, Marin stopped by with a box of pencils. George sent the old brass key in a padded envelope, saying he did not need to keep it anymore. Evelyn came in last, looked at the sign, and touched the word Brooks with 2 fingers. Caleb watched her do it. For many years, name had been something she protected him from. Now it sat on a window where anyone could see it, attached not to shame, but to a place where older people could bring papers they were afraid to sign. Evelyn lowered her hand and looked at him. Your father would have liked this," she said. Caleb unlocked the door, turned the sign to open, and let the morning in.